Thank you everyone for joining us today for Illinois ITE's August webinar. Before we get started on the presentation, I just wanted to give a reminder that the Illinois ITE, WTS, and ITS Midwest annual golf outing, this will be the 10th annual, will be taking place on August 26th at Topgolf in Schaumburg. So if you're interested in attending that, make sure you sign up. If you have any questions for our presenters today, please use the Q&A functionality built into Zoom, and we will try to get to those questions either during the presentation or afterwards as time allows. Our presentation today will be on grant funding, and our speakers will be Tammy Wierciak and Cmap. They're both from Metra Strategies. Tammy is Vice President at Metra Strategies. Tammy is responsible for researching and developing policy recommendations and implementation tactics, as well as building funding strategies and creating successful grant applications. She has produced and managed award-winning project advocacy and construction communication campaigns. Cma is COO at Metra Strategies. She has developed and written grant proposals resulting in almost $32 million in approved awards for both government and nonprofit clients. In addition to grant writing, Cma leads the firm's planning and project implementation work, overseeing best practice research and methodologies, writing technical reports, and managing all reporting aspects and project compliance requirements. Tammy, Cma, thank you both for joining us today, and you have the floor.
Andrew, thank you. Thank you for asking us, first of all, to present. We're excited to be here today virtually as it is, and just share some of the things we've picked up along the way. As Andrew mentioned, my grant writing actually started with nonprofit clients and then has moved into government agencies. So for today, we tailored this presentation thinking about what might be most important for you to know or you have questions about. We're going to cover the basic transportation funding sources and not really get into the details too much. So if you do have a specific question about one of the funding sources we are talking about, or even another one you've heard of, just put it in the chat, and then during the Q&A we can address that. So again, some of the topics we'll cover today is, will you be competitive? And really what you need to think about even before you're applying to, and if you're advising clients, if you're a consultant, some of the questions that you want them to think about. Fundable projects, what are the funding agencies really looking for when they fund projects? What makes a good project? The key elements of grant applications, some of the key areas that can be missteps and that you really need to focus on. Working with funding agencies, it's really about developing that relationship and building a relationship with the staff. They want to give money away to good projects. So how do you talk to them about your project and you're able to explain it so they understand it? And just kind of to wrap it up, the do's and don'ts, really standard, basic. That checklist is not going to be something you don't already know, but it's really just to emphasize how important it is to address those ideas or topics. So we'll start off. Oh, and then one more thing, actually, and Tammy, that's fine. You don't have to go back. I think one of the key things both Tammy and I want you to think about is that as we're talking about these transportation funding sources, we also want you to think about the bigger project and how you can creatively look at a mix of funding sources, break out your project in various elements or issue areas or needs, and combine multiple sources to fund a bigger project. So we have an example showing that as well. But that's really, as you're thinking about it, think about mixing and matching. And Tammy and I will just go back and forth on these slides and tag team. So I'm going to start off with, just want to make sure I can see the Q&A as well. All right, I'm going to start off with the federal transportation programs. I think whenever there's an announcement about federal grant funding available, everyone's ears perk up because it's usually a lot more money. And we're always getting calls from the people that we work with. They're getting questions from their elected officials, whether it's, the mayors, the presidents of the villages. It's like, there's this money available, what can we apply for? So I think the most important thing to be aware of is that whenever federal funding announcements come up, projects really need to be fairly beyond the conceptual and initial planning stages and really further along in the planning process. So that means it should already be in your capital improvement plan or a local or regional plan. If you have a really strong project that meets everything we're going to talk about today, but it's in the very early stages of planning, then the question you need to answer is, what do we need to do now so we can apply a year later or the following year? Not what do we need to do now to submit an application in 10 days or 2 weeks, because that's not going to be enough time for federal funding applications. So a quick overview of some of the kind of known and more well-known transportation grant programs. The RAISE grants were originally the Tiger grants and then billed for 3 years. And then the infra grants. These are I think the two more well-known federal transportation grants. Infra was just recently announced. Those awards were recently announced. And then the RAISE grant application deadline was last month. So the RAISE program probably has the broadest eligibility criteria for project type for transportation, highway, bridge, other roadway, public transportation, rail, intermodal projects. And the program criteria have stayed fairly consistent over all these years. But each year there might be a slightly new emphasis that the administration really wants to see these projects accomplish. And this current year cycle, that emphasis was climate change and environmental justice and equity. The most important thing about the RAISE grant program is that you have to show that the project will have a significant impact, and that relates to these merit criteria: state of good repair, safety, economic competitiveness, environmental sustainability, quality of life, innovation, partnerships, and then also the additional emphases, which this year was climate change and environmental justice and equity. So they need to be able to address not just one or two of these criteria, but across all of these criteria. A benefit cost analysis is required. So it's really important not only to have that technical element addressed, but also how do you weave that into the story? And how are you quantifying the benefits and showing that impact that translates into a better environment, better, service, whatever it is, depending on the project for the community. The other key thing for the RAISE grants, and this applies to pretty much all federal grant programs, is that you really want to show more than the minimum match. Usually the federal, non-federal is 80-20. But for RAISE and Tiger and Bills for all these years, the most competitive projects, unless if you're a high need community, the match for the awarded projects is usually at least 1-to-1, so 50% or even greater. A greater non-federal share compared to the federal share. So you're looking at having successful projects will have funding from multiple sources, more than 50%, potentially 50 to 60% of funds from local, non-federal, and then the remaining from the federal grant program. Infra grants are for regionally and nationally significant highway and freight projects, and projects must be on the national highway system or national freight highway network. Again, it's project readiness, the non-federal match amount, and partnerships, which are extremely important. And especially if it involves the railroads for the most part, or any type of, for the rail related projects, all project partners have to be on board and committed. That means you were talking to them like probably 2-3 years ago to get to the point where you're ready to apply and show that commitment. And you have, whether it's a funding commitment or right of way or whatever it is, in place when you apply. And I think that's it for the RAISE and infra. I'm not getting into the weeds of these grant programs, so feel free to chat your questions about those. So CRISI is the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program. That was funded for the last 3 years through 2020. And the goal of the program is to improve safety, efficiency of intercity commuter and freight rail systems, and also projects that have economic benefits. So 2021 may be a gap year, but this program is likely to continue. And I'll talk about the infrastructure bill and federal transportation funding in a minute. But this program is likely to continue in some version or another next year, potentially later this year. Again, as I said, with RAISE and infra, the match needs to be at least 1-to-1 or greater, and multiple partners and multiple funding sources. The TOD, it's been called the pilot TOD so far, Program for Transit-Oriented Development Planning, and it's really planning funds for at transit station areas. The categories are, it needs to be new fixed guideway or core capacity improvement, which is corridor capacity expansion or improvements. Applicants do need to be existing FTA grantees. And again, any questions about these, feel free to chat them. So this is really not grant funding programs, but just where we've been this year. Most of you may have been hearing about earmarks coming back this year. So 2020 really did mark the return of congressional earmarks, but it's being called congressionally directed spending. And the administration and the House and Senate have really established transparency guidelines. So the process is very, very specific, not how it was many, many years ago. It is meant to be an annual process. The most recent process the most recent deadlines were in May and April. So there are two avenues of funding for congressionally directed spending. One is through the community project funding request process, and that is for both members of the House and the Senate, and communities could submit projects for, a variety of project types, not just transportation, but including transportation. Everybody does have to follow the guidance established by each appropriations committee. So the way the legislators select the projects has to be by specific criteria. Communities that do get funded will have to hold to specific reporting requirements. It has been a little confusing this past year because there's also another avenue. I think mostly everybody probably heard about community project funding requests, but there's also another avenue, which is through the House TNI, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, for member designated projects. And this is really for surface transportation projects. So anything that could potentially be eligible for Tiger Rays could be submitted through this. And again, there's very specific requirements and guidance, and an online application form for each representative's website. What else? So as I mentioned, the deadline for this year was in April and May. So in terms of preparing for next year, it's really important, first of all, to review this guidance. It's available. It's available on our legislators' websites. It's available through the congressional websites. So reviewing the guidance and eligibility in order to advise clients. And then for any critical projects, this is really a good time to develop a project fact sheet, especially highlighting each of those criteria: the impact, the benefits, the schedule, the readiness. And reach out to your representatives now, set up meetings with them, discuss how important it is, how it benefits the constituents in their area, service area, or their representative area. So as soon as the process opens up, one is they're familiar enough with the project. It's a good project. Potentially any questions that need to be answered have been answered, making it easier for them to select a project out of, a list of 20, 30, 40 projects, whatever it is, or 50, who knows. And you're ready to submit it and have the information as soon as you need it. So if the process mirrors this year, potentially early next year by April, May, it might open up with some tweaks. I think this year was a learning curve for everybody, including, our representatives as well. Then one other thing regarding federal appropriations is the infrastructure bill. So in terms of the status, we've all been waiting for the federal funding, at least Tammy and I have been. I'm not sure about everyone else, about the status of infrastructure funding. So as of yesterday, the infrastructure bill did pass the Senate. It's at $1 trillion in total. And I'm just providing a few breakdowns from that 1 trillion that might be of interest to this audience. The biggest amount in terms of proportion is going to roads and bridges. So let's see what else have I missed. Regarding this, I think that the main point I want to make here is that the federal programs I talked about just previously, not only RAISE, but infra, CRISI, the pilot TOD, and potentially other federal transportation programs that are current. So the funding will either go to supplement those or create new versions of those in the coming years, or create new programs for transportation or allocations to states and MPOs to pass through. So we don't know what that looks like right now, but hopefully over the next few months, we'll have a few more details once it passes the Senate, and hopefully it passes the Senate, the House, not the Senate. So that's the next step for the bill, is to go through the House. And I'm going to pass it over to Tammy, and she's going to cover some of the state programs.
Yeah, so you've probably heard of some if not most of the state programs. The Transportation Enhancement Program, which just was recently announced, provides funding for projects that provide transportation benefit and meet a need. So it can't just be random things that projects want to implement. This last call was one of the highest calls of funding allotment that has been allocated due to the state's capital bill. The total allotment was over $100 million. And this covered bike ped facility improvements, streetscapes, historic preservation, stormwater management, water pollution control, and so a new trend that's been seen more and more in these grant programs is a different match for high need communities. So anytime that you can go look at low moderate income census tracts and make those cases, or if the funding agency lists a certain map they want you to use, a certain place to identify, Cmap calls them cohort communities, you need to go really look and make sure your community is in that, so you can either maximize a match that's higher so that the state was paying 90% for high need communities, or they then qualify for maybe a phase 1 funding as well, where other communities might not. So really make sure you've got that information before you start your application, and weave that into your application throughout, that it's a high need community. The other recent program that opened is Safe Routes to School. And this is really trying to find ways to improve bicycling and walking to schools within a 2-mile radius of a school. So types of eligible projects within the Safe Routes to School could be sidewalk improvements, filling in sidewalk gaps, sidewalk widenings, traffic calming measures such as like a speed bump or raised crossings, traffic control devices, pavement markings, pedestrian or bicycle activated signal upgrades, these things, things that are going to make it safer and easier for people to bike or walk to school. It even will cover things like planning or programs, bike racks at school, shelters, things of that nature. Another state program is the Truck Access Rail Program. This may be one that not everyone is as familiar with. This is to help communities upgrade their roads for 80,000-pound truckloads. And this is an annual call, and it provides a decent amount of money per lane mile or intersection at a 50-50 match for communities to really upgrade their roads for those truck routes. And the Highway Safety Improvement Program, this is really addressing safety, whether it's injuries or fatalities for people leaving the roadway, intersection issues, pedestrians, accidents. So any measures that can be taken to help reduce safety issues. And I know this one, the Green Infrastructure Grant Opportunity, GIGO, from the EPA isn't traditionally a transportation option for projects, but Seema and I liked, as she mentioned at the beginning, like to think of this one as if you are designing a roadway and are doing a streetscape project, what are those elements that might not qualify under your road resurfacing reconstruction project? GIGO might be a good option for you to do some of those best management practices, provide water quality improvements, decrease stormwater runoff. You know, if you're putting in permeable pavers in the parking lane along a street, or a rain garden as part of the separation between the road and the sidewalk. You know, those type of things, you can start to package these and pull that element out of as an ineligible item for your road funding, but you add this other funding source and you can now fund that, whereas a town in the past will say, oh, I don't have the money for that piece. Well, you know, you just need to package these things together. And additionally, the ICC's Grade Crossing Protection Fund. So I know there's a lot of dangerous highway rail crossings in the state. There are some programs trying to address them, but if you have a community who has an underpass that's needed or an overpass, this is a great funding source. Applications are collected on an ongoing cycle throughout the year, and the ICC then packages them all up and looks at them at one time and creates their 5-year program. And even if you're not selected in that initial program, they hold your application for a number of years. And the next year, if they don't get as many applications, they'll go back to that pile and say, okay, well, this one was still a good one. We can move this one up now in the next call. So even if you don't get selected in the beginning, you still could get a call later on, a year or two later, from the ICC saying, are you still interested? Because we have funding, we didn't have enough projects, we'd like to pull your application back. Again, this can cover grade separations. Pedestrian grade separations is another one, interconnects, traffic warning signals, remote monitoring devices. And something I want to point out, this funding source is a little bit different than your typical road funds. So if you're selected by ICC, yay, exciting, you see that you're in the program, what do you do next? The ICC has different contacts for the area. That ICC staff person who's assigned will let you know what the steps are to follow, but the funds aren't available until they get obligated in one or two different ways. One can just be a stipulated agreement or petition is the second option. A stipulated agreement, pretty easy. It's just a nice little agreement with ICC, away you go. A petition is going to probably require the community's attorney to get involved and write a petition, and it goes to an administrative law judge who then reviews it, reviews the exhibits, make sure everyone's on board. Again, like Cma said earlier, you should be talking to the railroad way in advance, because they're going to reach out to the railroad, make sure that, you know, whatever grade crossing you're impacting, that they know about the project, they support the project. So once that process hopefully gets approved and you move through it, then the award is processed through IDOT, through your local district office. So then you get to go a little bit back to a more normal, there's IDOT forms that you fill out and follow that process. But there is that extra step of either needing an agreement or to petition to move the project forward. And another one that we wanted you to think about that isn't a traditional grant opportunity is contacting local legislators. Member initiative funds, just like the federal ones, there are state initiatives that, you know, something that's not traditional, that doesn't fit nicely into the other programs can get funded this way. You know, you have building improvements that need to happen. Equipment, like a generator for the water tower, things like that, that are still good projects that just don't have traditional funding sources. And Cma mentioned earlier, a fact sheet's a great thing. You need to be getting this in front of your legislator early and often, making sure they know about the project, having something that sits on their desk so that when capital bill time comes or budget gets passed, those things can happen very quickly. That information needs to be at their fingertips so it can get put into the bill. And once, you know, you get lucky enough that it ends up in a bill, it gets adopted, what next? Well, usually this funding goes through the DCO agency, and they have a specific little call for projects just for your project with an application just for your project, and you still need to fill out your application at that point. It still needs to have all the information that you would as if you were doing a normal grant application, but it's specific so only your community would qualify for those funds and get approved for it. So it'll very specifically say Village of X, you know, is the only one eligible. Next, we'll go over a couple of regional options. If you live in the Chicagoland area, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program through Cmac at Cmap, that is a call for projects that's done in coordination with the next one, Transportation Alternative Programs. It's a nice workbook that covers, you know, you can apply for all of these at once, both these at once, or just an individual project. The Cmac option has to do with air quality control or congestion relief. So you have to be able to show emissions reductions, and that one has an 80-20 match. The TAP program is for bicycle facilities, and they have to be implementing a regional greenways or trails project. So again, it needs to be an identified project. It can't just be, oh, it'd be great to put a trail through the parks. It needs to be something that's documented and in a plan. And one other thing, phase one for these programs is typically a local agency's responsibility, again, unless you can show a hardship or they're in Cmap's cohort community. Cmap has a list on their website of where each community ranks, and you know, they need to be, if it's a low income community, they could qualify for phase one funding to help with the project as well. The other ones that I'm sure everyone's probably heard about is the Surface Transportation Local Program. Each of these, the Surface Transportation Program, which goes after my heart because I ran a program for a while, there's several local council of mayors throughout the region, and each of them has a methodology and a call for projects. Their methodologies their point systems might be different on each of those methodologies, just slightly based on what that council's priorities are going to be, whether it's helping implement green infrastructure as part of the project, you might get bonus points, or bike infrastructure, freight improvements, complete streets, all those could be different things that will shift the points slightly in each council. And the awards are going to range as well. Some councils have a 70-30 match, an 80-20, some have, each council's annual allotment is based on the population in that council. So some councils have a lot more projects that they can fund. Others that are smaller councils can only fund a few projects every year. So it's important to make sure you're reading that methodology. The next call for projects for that program will be in January, with the projects being announced probably in March. So you should be preparing now, looking at what projects each community has, what their priorities are, what has maybe phase one done already, you know, lining up all those things that are identified in the methodology of that will be needed. And then if you have a larger project that a local council can't fund, the Surface Transportation Shared Fund is the program. This one is run through Cmap, the applications are through Cmap, and this runs in the off years from the STPL. So this year is the Surface Transportation Local Program call, next year will be the Surface Transportation Shared Fund call. These are for projects that are larger, over $5 million, or there's at least two partners. So it's multiple communities trying to build a road improvement, a community and a transit agency working on a project. So those will be for your bigger projects. And then Seema and I'll tag team on this one a little bit. A lot of people have been hearing about the COVID relief funds for highway infrastructure that's been talked about recently, and these are being allocated through Cmap. And Seema, do you want to add to this program?
Yeah. So I think many of you may have seen, especially if you are a consultant to a community forward, an IDOT circular letter, or you may have gotten it about COVID relief funds. This was back a few months ago, maybe 4 to 6 months ago. So these are COVID relief allocations that are federal funds allocated to states, and it would be distributed to MPOs for transportation related funding. So the Cmap region allocation is, as it says, 42.6 million. The amount of funding is similar to the STP funding allocations and methodology that's distributed throughout the state and region. So the funding for COVID relief will follow a similar methodology. Guidance should be available in September 2021. Right now, Cmap and staff are thinking about how this could function in conjunction with the sort of SDP projects as well, since it's similar methodology and for similar projects and really addressing a need in the region, specifically looking at the current active and contingency list. So some of the guidance will become more clear. Potentially projects that are on the SDP active or contingency list could be funded under COVID relief funds, because this funding must be obligated by December 2024. So for that purpose, to make sure that we maximize the use of those COVID relief funds before we let it lapse, and we want to use it all up. And in either case, however it happens, there will be funding available, whether through the next SDB calls, local or shared fund, or through some kind of separate COVID relief process. And the funds are to be made available October 2021. So we'll keep that, we'll monitor that and share that information out. And Cmap, I'm sure, will be distributing that information. So just keep a lookout for that.
And then two other regional options that are done together. The call for projects is done together is Cmap's local technical assistance program. So if you have a community who has not started anything, is hard to get off the ground, this might be a great place for that community to start. Cmap helps these communities put together some community plans, whether it's a bike plan, a comprehensive plan, zoning plans, updating all sorts of whatever it is, you know, any community plans within. But this is also a great way to get your project inside of a plan and documented, which is usually one of those things that you get bonus points. Is it identified? Has it been held for a public meeting? Well, you go through the LTA process, which usually doesn't have, has Cmap staff doing it in-house, these studies, you can then say, yes, it was documented, it was part of a public process, and you can get some additional points for implementation grants later on. RTA similarly does an access to transit study, access to transit grants, which obviously the projects has to have some sort of transit component to it, whether it's improving access into a CTA station, bicycle, you know, at pace options, things like that. And what RTA does is they package these and then submit all of these applications as one Cmaq application to Cmap later on. So that way it can be a more competitive application. They're helping put that together. And RTA will then help you fund your local match through Cmaq, which is usually a 20% local match. RTA usually picks up 10% of that. So it even reduces the community's requirements on that, and they help make sure you're hitting your quarterly reports or other things. So you get a little bit more RTA staff support with this one as well. And some other ones that are great, Invest in Cook is a great one. If you can connect it to Cook County's Connecting Cook Transportation Plan, which focuses on highway, pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and freight improvements, pretty broad. If you can find something in their Connecting Cook plan that you can connect your project to, that's what they're looking for in that one. And this is a great program because these aren't federal funds. You can use this money then to help reduce a community's local match on some federal funds. So you can pair Invest in Cook, if you're in Cook County, with some other funding sources. So, you know, if the 20% these bigger projects scares some communities, you can look for these options for that to help with that match. Cdbg is another one that we wanted to mention. You know, it's a federal pass-through for entitlement communities. So you want to look up whether your community is a low to moderate income community to make sure there's that need to help with the scoring. That's one of the key elements of this project. And this will help with the capital improvements in public infrastructure. So it can really help with some of those other types of projects. And similar to the GIGO one that I mentioned earlier, MWD has a green infrastructure grant opportunity. Funding is available for construction only this time around, but it's looking at green infrastructure projects. Combined sewers are prioritized, evidence of flood-prone areas. Green alleys is a great project that gets funded through this one. So that's, again, something that isn't funded through a lot of other sources, but you can show some flood relief for communities and take care of an infrastructure need for towns that often gets neglected or overlooked in the alleyways. But that's a great way to address some flooding issues. And I'll turn it over to Seema again to talk about some private sources.
Feel free to chat a message if I break in and out. My internet connection might be a little bit unstable right now. So I'm just going to spend a minute or two on this slide. And these are really just two examples of non-traditional programs that can fund pieces of larger infrastructure projects, especially revitalization and redevelopment types of projects. The first one, Our Town, can help communities integrate placemaking elements into their projects, public art installations, things like that, some creative designs, an opportunity for local artists to get involved. And then the other one is a regional collaborative that Chicago Community Trust is also a partner of and is helping fund and implement this effort. And it's really to help revitalize the Chicago area rivers and use them as catalysts for community improvements, particularly communities that might be low income and underserved. It does have a very specific geographic focus. So there is a helpful map of which communities are eligible. If you're interested in knowing more about it, you can follow up with us after or make a note of it in the chat, and we'll get that out for Andrew to distribute. But these are just two examples, and I think the main point is that when you look at these kinds of programs, they can be actually overwhelming. They're gonna require a lot more time and effort. Potentially not the Chicago Community Trust one, but like the National Endowment for the Arts. There's another one called People for Bikes. We didn't put that in here. We can just go on and on. But the narrative and the application requirements can be very time consuming, and the actual funding amounts may feel like it's not worth the time. People for Bikes is $10,000. There is merit in pursuing those because while it takes a lot more time to put those applications together, it does have an intangible benefit of making your project look more attractive to even other funders that you can potentially get a lot more money out of. So it's a trade-off, but it's just thinking about that big picture again, and how do you leverage other sources of funding?
And then we just wanted to give you kind of a case study example of a project that our firm helped with. The Western Springs Pedestrian Underpass was a project that had stalled. It had received a long time ago, if anyone's been around as long as Seema and I have, high priority HPP funding, which was the original earmarks to do phase one. And it had sat so long that the community was actually at risk of having to pay that phase one funding back because they hadn't done anything with the project. And the community said, this is really a priority. We've had people killed crossing the tracks. It's by a school, it's by a park, it's in our downtown. We need an underpass. So we looked at it and said, okay, we like this challenge. And you can see there's a long list, and there's even a couple on here that aren't listed, of funders that we went through to get pieces of the pie put together, because underpasses, if you've worked on them, are big ticket items. So, you know, we're getting funding from, you know, Surface Transportation Program, the ICC, Metra, Invest in Cook helped with some of the local costs. I mean, private funding was a big thing too. You know, we had to make sure it was also doable on the community side, that we didn't just get the federal side covered, because it was still going to have a huge local price tag. So we were able to shrink that local price tag with some of these other sources. So one of the things with all these sources though is knowing what can be matched and what can't be. You know, you can't match federal with federal funding. You have to have federal with local or private funding. You also have to be able to coordinate the funding and the timing. What are the deadlines? When do things need to be obligated or spent by? What is eligible for each funding source? So when it comes time to actually start billing down these grants, which bill goes to which person? And it's also a coordination element on then the community side. Once you turn this over, they have to know all the different amounts and who they can send to and how they send it. You know, okay, ICC's, like I said, is an IDOT form. This is how you're going to get reimbursed through this way. You know, some of these you have to pay up front and then get reimbursed for. So having all those details, you know, is one of those drawbacks. You get all the funding and you can build it, but now you've got to, you know, have all your I's dotted and T's crossed to know where the funding is coming from and how to use it. But you can make a big ticket project happen if you look at all the different options and how to combine them the right ways.
Okay, will you be competitive? So here we just want to cover the main areas you need to think about before applying. And some of these we've already mentioned in one way or another as we were talking about the specific grant programs previously. But again, a lot of the repetitiveness you may feel like as we're going through the slides is just to hone in on why it's so important. And these are really the main things you want to think about. So impact, the goals and impact of your project. Is this a good project? Is it one that's really important for the community? Has it been identified in a local or regional plan? Funders really want to know that it's going to make a difference and it's going to solve a priority issue or need. So while there may be many important projects, just in terms of the scale and the impact and where there's external funding coming, it's really looking at the value. What are they getting for the amount of investment they're making? What is the measurable difference? Which is why resurfacing projects generally don't make the cut for a lot of these grant programs. And the second most important thing, or the second equally important element, is the alignment with the funding agency's goal. A project has to be more than eligible. It really has to help the funding agency meet their goals and priorities. And in the case of a lot of the government grants, any of their statutory requirements as well. So that's something you just have to take a look at. So these are the two baseline. If there's a strong and clear need and also aligned with the grant program itself. Third element, and this is kind of more like in order of importance in some ways, support for the project. Can you show local support for the project? Is there any documentation of community meetings? Can you get letters of support from local groups or other agencies that say, yes, this is an important project for us? Showing the local investment, funders want to know that the communities want the project enough to get it done without delays. So documentation of what has been done to date, do you have that? Any public meetings to get community input? Where are you with your design, conceptual design, preliminary design? And that feeds into project readiness as well. But showing the local investment is, yes, you want this project enough to spend local funds on that design. So when it comes time to go to the funding agency, you want to quantify that. We've already spent $200,000 doing design for this. We are ready to do this project and we need some help. Project readiness, Tammy's going to go into that a little bit when we talk about the key application elements. But in terms of, are you going to be competitive? Where are you with readiness? Again, this is with those federal grants especially, but all these programs, Cmap, as Tammy mentioned, you need phase one done for most communities. So where are you with that? Oh, one thing I forgot to mention with the local investment is that we always recommend to communities, and they don't want to hear this, but we still try to push them, is can you give more than the minimum required match? Can you do 30%? Can you do 40%? What's the highest you could do? That's really going to go a long way to helping you get funded the remaining whatever. It's better to get 60% rather than not get 80%. So thinking about that. The last box is really, should you apply even if you're competitive? And just to be realistic about the time frame and effort needed to submit a quality proposal. And that's always going to be kind of a, you know, a judgment call. But are you going to apply this year and try to get this in 1 week? Or are you going to just get everything that you need and increase the chances for getting funded the next year? This is just quickly going through everything I talked about in the previous slide. This is really what the outcome is, fundable projects. The goals and objectives align with the funding program priorities. You do have broad support for the project and you can document and show evidence. Multiple benefits, not just transportation, you know, state of good repair, but there's a safety element, you know, people can get to work faster. You're incorporating some green infrastructure elements into your transportation project. There's environmental benefits, all of that. Local investment, as much as you can put in, plus additional funding sources. And the last is that the project does tie into larger plans. So not just the local plan, but look at your regional plans, look at regional priorities, on to 2050 priorities. How does your project help further some of those, or, you know, is identified, your project type is identified in on to 2050, for example.
So first thing I want to start with is your project narrative. This is key to a good application. It needs to tell a story. It's not your technical description of the project. It needs to tell a good tale, weave the scope with the bigger compelling argument. It's not just about how much water you're going to take out of the waterways. That's going to be quantified in your application. And while you want to sneak that in there, you want to talk about all the houses that are getting flooded and how that's impacting the residents, or how this road is going to help expand job opportunities by creating more businesses and expand the business park. And it's in a low to moderate income and it will greatly improve people's lives. You want to weave that story and really make a compelling argument for why your project's important. You know, weave that evidence in, but tell the story. The next one is partners and letters of support. A lot of applications, not all, will give you bonus points. How many bonus points can you give, and how can you max that out? They say, you know, for five letters, you get 5 bonus points. Well, try and get all 5 letters, you know, and look at not just, you know, your legislators are good ones if it's a state agency that you're applying to, but what are some other stakeholders that might be impacted by the project? You know, is it something you're selling to DCO as a good thing for the business community that will improve jobs? Well, can you get a chamber of commerce or some businesses to write some letters? If it's an ICC project, can you have a letter from the railroad that say that they're a project partner and they're, you know, supporting the project? Those things matter. Data requirements. Look at this immediately. Look, I always create a little checklist. What are the things you need to get done? Many of you probably have gotten the last minute call before an application is done that a community is trying to do on their own and saying, I need a detailed cost analysis. And your heads probably explode. We don't want to start that last minute if you can help it. Because those cost numbers are weaved throughout the application. You know, they're asking for the total at the front as well as a detailed cost estimate as an attachment. So those numbers need to be done as soon as possible. Do you need a benefit cost analysis? That takes time to do. Look up, as we mentioned earlier, census or income track information for the community. You know, if you can find that and weave that into your narrative, or add that into different detail points. Some of those things aren't just an easy go to the census. Last summer when we were doing all of the DCO ones, those took time to find the right track, to zoom into where you needed to be, to pull the numbers about minorities, about workers, you know, like it takes time to do. So don't wait to the last minute for those things. And then project readiness, like Seema talked. These agencies have been doing this for a long time, a lot of these grants. They're gonna know if you haven't started phase one, if you haven't talked to a railroad, that you're not hitting your timelines. They're gonna know that you're not submitting reasonable things if you haven't done those things. So make sure you've got good timelines that are reasonable. You're meeting the milestones that are set out in the application, that you've got good detailed budgets that look at what's eligible items and what aren't eligible items and have those broken out. Make sure you've got that all set up as soon as possible. And then your key elements, you know, this may sound silly, but make sure you've got all your required attachments. Some agencies will follow up with you. Some agencies will just kick you and say it was an incomplete application. Review, review, review. Make sure you've got all those attachments. Make sure they're high quality. If they want a map, make sure it's a good quality map that has the directions, north, south, east on it, that identifies the project location very clearly. Look for ways to maximize your score. You know, if you can add letters of support, if you add photos, look at each category for scoring and see where you can maximize that score, where you need to find those key words and weave them in to your project. And like I said, spend time on that narrative. Don't wait and just slap together something very technical. That's the technical description you'd give to IDOT. Write a good narrative with those keywords, phrases. Connect to the project, connect to the agency's goals. If it's something the governor's promoting, what is his goals? What has he said publicly that he's going to achieve? Make sure you're working that into your narrative.
So working with funding agencies, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's really about building that relationship. Even if you have a pretty straightforward project and you really don't have any questions, just reach out and let them know, hey, we're interested in submitting this project. Do you have time to discuss it? Hopefully you can get on a call. Would recommend having the call, you know, voice conversations. Emails are still fine, based on, you know, time. Some staff do prefer email correspondence, but do your best to reach out to them. Some agencies actually have different, I guess, wording when they announce a grant opportunity. They may say, we suggest you reach out to agents, you know, reach out to us to discuss the project first. They may say, you must reach out to us. So whether they say suggested or they provide the option, take it as, yes, you definitely must reach out because there are other communities reaching out. You want to establish that relationship. You want to be able to tell them what this project is that they hear, that they may not get from the actual application itself when they're reviewing it. And just prepare for those meetings. Know the funding program, you know, inside out. List your questions for anything you're confused about, and be ready to answer questions from the agency based on, you know, some of the need, like what are you trying to do, about how much is it going to cost. Most of the time, our first question for any potential grant application, well, what's the cost? Well, we're not sure yet. So you don't want to say we're not sure yet. That is telling that staff person that, okay, this project is nowhere near ready to be submitted as an application. So just have some of those ready. And then some of these other things, again, they can be very helpful when you're submitting, when you're even thinking about applying and you're not sure. Review those previously awarded projects. Definitely attend those webinars and ask your questions. The last one is really about after you've submitted an application and you get questions, that's a good sign. You know, they think that you will, that your application is, you know, first of all, eligible, meets the criteria, and good enough to follow up on. So be responsive and go above and beyond and give them exactly what they want, because at this point, they need to narrow down their selection. If they're not getting the information they need, it's too much of a hassle for them to follow up with you continuously. So just go above and beyond and maybe give them more than they're even asking for. It makes their job easier. Application denied. So of course, there's only so much money to go around, and not every great project or even good project or even the best project is going to get funded. So I would say from this list, that first one is the main reason. Hopefully Agencies are really not getting a lot of applications that are just ineligible, and they're getting good projects. That's usually the most common reason. Project readiness issues is another one, which is why we say start early, and that local investment doesn't align with funder priorities. If you haven't done your homework, then that's going to be the reason. The narrative piece that Tammy talked about, they don't get it. They don't get why you need this, money. They don't get why it's important for the community. Some of the other ones, it's, we do this all the time, but we will double check, like triple check, quadruple check those missing attachments. When you are working with all of the requirements, something could easily slip through the crack. Call for feedback for sure. Most agencies want to give you the feedback, and it's super helpful to get ready to apply the following year. And definitely keep applying. If it's a good project, just keep applying and you will get funded at some point. Do's and don'ts, again, this is that repetitiveness, or this is that, what Tammy said, this might sound silly, this, but whether you're a professional grant writer or not, this is like critical. Like, these are the things that make you want to pull your hair out if one of this is the reason that you didn't get awarded. So missing the deadline, not having all your signatures early enough, and just planning for it. If it's a federal grant, you really need to do your homework and understand the submission process for federal grants. Have somebody outside of your division, your team, take a look and see if they understand what you're trying to say. And if they don't get it, the funder is not going to get it. And verify the submission requirements again and again. I feel like do read the program guidelines and eligibility criteria 5 times. I think that really addresses all of these. So one of the main things is if there's a repeat call for projects every year and it's the same program, you still want to read it 5 times, because it just takes one new thing to show up in small print somewhere, and then you realize you didn't address it. And that does happen more frequently than you would think. The last thing is, if you're a consultant and writing an application for multiple communities, use tracking for your hard copy submissions, but also make sure you submit 1 community per package. If it's a hard copy package, don't put them all in one packet. You really want to keep that tracking and documentation that you sent it. Agencies are getting tons and tons of applications, and hard copy especially. Hard copies, especially in COVID times, is something that you want to make sure gets tracked and received by the funder.
So at this point, I think we do have a few questions.
Yeah, thank you both Tammy and Seema for the presentation. We're coming up right on an hour, but we do have a few questions. Seema, you were answering them in chat, but if you wanted to answer them right now as well, just to make sure everybody gets the answers to them. So the first question we had was, does high need communities mean economically disadvantaged or a clear transportation need?
Yes, and it generally means it's an economic disadvantage. Unfortunately, there's no clear key, universal criteria that's used. Different agencies use different criteria. So you really need to look at what they're saying. It could be median income. It could be federal low to moderate income data. It could mean economically distressed criteria based on unemployment. So there are different criteria, and it's just taking a look at which specifically criteria that they're looking to identify high need communities as. Then there was another question about Safe Routes to School. That's actually just been recently announced. And that will only fund construction and construction engineering costs as eligible. We do have a comment, and I'll just read it out. Often communities develop a need for a project based on resident comments, complaints, and are looking for a quicker solution that is a lower overall cost for the community. Many communities seem to be set up to only react to residents rather than planning the projects in advance by anticipating future community needs. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that goes over, I think the challenge is always that planning process, setting up a plan that can be implementable, first having a plan or updating your comprehensive plan or sub-area plan, whatever it is, but then making it implementable. And it does seem to be a cycle for that. I know Cmap is working to address this issue, especially for, you know, more higher need communities as well. Part of that goes to that staffing and resources and capacity. So that's a good point. And if anybody else wants to chime in. There was one question in the Q&A about the Chicago Community Trust grant program. So the Fox River is that part of the eligible area. So no, unfortunately it's not, and neither are like Des Plaines area, Des Plaines River, or any of the you know, further west tributary rivers, DuPage River and all of that. So it's really looking at around the city of Chicago. And the Chicago.
That's a good point that if it's not even in the city of Chicago, then look at the counties. Different counties have programs or water districts, and they have funding sources that they may be willing. So even if a project falls out of one funding source, look to see if a similar funding source is available in another area or different programs that might meet that same need. So I know, you know, DuPage County has some stormwater stuff going on that for communities that aren't in Cook County. So there are options.
We have one more question, if the slides will be made available to all attendees.
Yes, yes, for sure. We can, you know, we'll give them to Andrew to share with the participants.
Sure, and we normally post our presentations on the Illinois IT YouTube account. So Tammy and Cmap, if you'd be fine with that, we will post it there and you can rewatch the presentation and share.
My kids will be excited. I'll be a YouTube star.
Okay, looks like that's all the questions we have. So thank you again, Cmap and Tammy, for joining us and sharing all your expertise. Thank you all of our attendees as well. And I hope everyone has a nice rest of their day.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.